So I've been on a journey of some 18 months or so, and it actually began a few years ago, and it came out of two things. One was at the MLM, which is our mission leaders meeting that happens in Colorado every year. So it would have been in October, and I had just finished my PhD in missiology from Fuller that July. So a few months later, here I finished a terminal degree, and someone walks up to me, and they have a word for me. Now that happens fairly frequently, and sometimes those are really valuable, and sometimes those are less valuable. But this happened to be someone in whom I have a lot of confidence and trust, and she walked up and she said, "I know this sounds a little bit weird, but God is calling you back to kindergarten." And I thought about that, and my initial response was to negotiate. Might it be another doctorate? Could I perhaps do another master's degree? Maybe a college degree, since I actually never did one of those. Maybe high school, but it was really clear that God was calling me back to kindergarten. And so it's taken me a while to unpack what that is, but I knew that that meant that I had to go back to the beginning and learn again. This was during the time in which Bert was still our national director, but Phil had been chosen, so he knew that was coming. And so Monday night of our leadership gathering, which I believe was in Nashville that year, Bert shared what had happened over the last year, giving his report to the leadership of the Vineyard. And Phil had come to me that evening before Bert spoke, before our gathering, and he said, "Listen, I'm on tomorrow morning, and I want to share my time up front with a group of people. I want you to be one of those. And what I want from you is a biblical theology of mission and vision for the future, and you have 4 minutes in which to do that." So I went away, I picked a verse from Genesis, a verse from Revelation, and I knew that Phil was going to want some kind of number, not just let's have more Vineyard churches around the world. So at that point, we had planted about 800 churches out of what the U.S. Vineyard churches had been doing. And so I initially thought about 800 churches, but then I thought, no, we have momentum, things are growing. Countries like Brazil are doing really well. We ought to stretch that a little bit, so I thought 1,000. And then at that point, I thought, well, maybe I ought to pray about this. And so I sat down, and I thought I was actually being quite magnanimous and letting God to pick. And I thought, seriously, if he says, if I feel like God said 800, that's what I'm going to say tomorrow morning. If I feel like God said 1,000, that's what I'm going to say tomorrow morning. And I prayed, and as clear as I've ever heard God speak, he chose not 800 or 1,000, but what I sensed him saying was, you, the Vineyard, have learned to plant hundreds of churches. Now I want you to learn to plant thousands. And the operative word is learn. And so I've been on a journey for a couple of years to visit people who have been the ones who have facilitated the planting of thousands of churches. And so I've met with house church pastors from China. I've been with the disciple-making movement in East and West Africa. I've been with the Fresh Expressions people. I spent a day with Ralph Moore of Hope Chapel. I met with one of the largest pastors the pastor of one of the largest churches in Indonesia, who leads the largest Pentecostal denomination in the country. And out of that, I discovered 10 points of commonality between all of those movements. And as I began to list those and synthesize what I had seen over that period of time, I realized that all of those were evident in the Vineyard at its inception. And so I've taken and translated those back into Vineyardese in realizing that perhaps the presence of those things when our movement began might have been a portion of the reason that the movement grew as rapidly as it did.